Hi everyone, I'm Brian LaRosa, and welcome to LaRosa's Trains. Normally, I tell locomotive history facts whenever I review an O-gauge engine from either Lionel or MTH. But last year, I did a video exclusively on real railroad history. This is A Century of Electromotive Diesel, aka the 10 Commandments of Being a Good Locomotive Builder. It is considered to be my first history video not associated with a model train product review. If you're interested, it's still available on my YouTube channel. In this video, we're going to talk about road locomotives, but some of you may be confused by that term, which is used in a lot of printed media and online sources specializing in railroad trains. Whenever I do a Google search for the keywords road locomotive, I could see a lot of photos showing what appear to be steam tractors rather than trains. I'd rather refer to them as traction engines, like Trevor the Traction Engine. It's understandable to say that a road usually refers to a long, smooth surface for automobiles and trucks, but this is not what I have in mind. So here's the proper meaning. A road locomotive is defined as any type of rail vehicle, be it steam, diesel, or electric, intended for freight or passenger services on long distances. Those distances are referred to as main lines. For that reason, I often use the term mainline on a lot of my blog posts. To better illustrate the definition, let me show you what is not considered a road locomotive. This is a switcher, or a shunter as what the British call it. It is used to sort freight cars in a railroad yard or an industrial area. Some switchers can also tow bigger locomotives in a shop area for maintenance or repair. Because of those duties, shunters are small and are generally not intended to pull long strings of cars, nor for high speeds like a mainline engine would. And because of their size, they require small amounts of fuel, so they are not efficient enough to run longer distances. Switchers had been built in many different shapes. When steam locomotives ruled the rails, those engines working in the yard were typically built as O40s, O60s, and O80s, so no lead or trailing wheels were required for that sort of work, just the drivers. Tenders on most switchers are lower in height than the engine, not only for a small supply of coal and water, but more importantly, for visibility in reverse. Alternatively, there are also some tank engines that don't require a separate tender, much like Thomas the Tank Engine. While they are useful for shunting due to their bidirectional operations, some were signed specifically to suburban commuter rail services in North America. This reminds me of Thomas because he doesn't just shunt freight cars or coaches, but can also pull trains on his own branch line on the fictional island of Sodor, west of Great Britain. When it comes to diesel power, the earliest known examples were built as box cab switchers. By the early 1930s, diesel shunters were built with the more common hood-style body featuring an end cab and outside walkways. Other types had center cabs or steeple cabs, such as those seen on some industrial switchers. Although some early switchers had high engine hoods, most had low hoods for, again, visibility in both directions. Most diesel shunters lack several details that are present on road locomotives. Examples include multiple unit connectors, dynamic brakes, and steam heaters. They also ride on switcher trucks instead of road trucks, as speed is not a priority for them. However, switchers have been occasionally seen trailing behind a road locomotive consist in some freight trains, but they are usually dead in tow and not providing power. The most modern diesel switchers feature more than one engine generator set to reduce fuel consumption and exhaust emissions. These are called genset locomotives. There were some North American electric switchers, typically with steeple cabs, but they were not quite as common as diesels. So, these are the basics of a shunting locomotive. Now let's talk about the types of road locomotives over the years, or should I say mainline locomotives. Before I continue, it should be noted that the two similar terms, railroad and railway, have virtually the same meaning, but their differences are rather arbitrary. If you'd like to learn more about them, I recommend watching this comparison video uploaded by Amtrak Guy 365. He did a pretty good job explaining all the details. Anyway, we'll begin with the steam era. I'm not going to mention all the wheel arrangements, simply because there are too many of them, but I will name a few to show you what is intended for mainline duty. During the 19th century and early 20th century, many steam locomotives had 4 drive wheels, and the most notable example at that time was the 440 American, or an 8-wheeler if you count all the wheels below the engine. This arrangement was later augmented by a single trailing axle, resulting in the 442 Atlantic, an ideal choice for carrying passengers at higher speeds. More powerful steam engines mean more wheels required to support them. Here's a brief list of the most popular wheel arrangements with 6 and 8 drivers. To create an even larger locomotive, the most effective method was an articulated steam engine, which contains 2 or even 3 sets of drive wheels, allowing the first set to independently turn from the rest of the machine. The first diesel road locomotives in North America were also box cabs, which had to be longer than switchers for more efficient operation over long distances. Beginning in the 1930s, streamlining was the key for higher speeds, not just for steam locomotives, but also for diesels. So the first successful diesel-powered passenger train was the Burlington Zephyr. However, the inflexible semi-permanent coupling system on streamliners caused railroads to request a more convenient locomotive design. Here comes the cab unit. Electromotive came first, with the 1800 horsepower E-unit passenger diesel. The company later introduced the famous F-unit series, primarily for freight duty. Other builders introduced their own 6-axle and 4-axle cab units for passenger and freight services, respectively. While these designs look gorgeous for many railroad fans, the main disadvantage was the lack of rearward visibility, since the so-called covered wagons all had fully enclosed bodies. Here's the solution. Take a regular diesel switcher with its long engine hood and cab, move its components to a longer frame, fasten a pair of road trucks underneath it, and then attach the short hood or nose to one end of the frame. Now, we have just built a road switcher. Also called hood units, road switchers were initially assigned to branch line services, but ultimately became more suitable for mainline freight trains. The American Locomotive Company, or ALCO, started the concept with its RS-1 model. On early hood units, both the long and short hoods were lower than the cab, allowing for bidirectional visibility. When EMD introduced the GP7 and GP9, later road switchers would have higher hoods to match the profile of the cab, and eventually to make room for bigger engines. In the 1950s, 6-motor hood units such as the SD7 and SD9 became available. Due to their high tractive effort, these locomotives were ideal for pushing freight cars up a hump, that is, an artificial hill in a yard, as well as helper duty. In those days, 4-axle diesels were still used for hauling freight trains, but their 6-axle counterparts eventually dominated the railroads within the next 2 decades. Moving into the 60s, the low nose eventually became the standard short hood on newer road switchers, although some railroads, like the Norfolk and Western and the Southern, still preferred the high nose design. At the same time, the Union Pacific and even the Southern Pacific experimented with 8-axle, double-engine diesels, including the Locomotive DD35 and DDA40X, the General Electric U50, and the extremely rare Alco C855. While cab units were no longer in production by this time, a new generation of covered wagons, called cowl units, were introduced. Cowls were used to replace the older cab units for passenger trains, but some were also built for freight duty. These locomotives, along with the DDA-40X, featured a wide nose, which eventually evolved into the Canadian Comfort Cab in the early 1970s. Additionally, some Canadian railroads purchased cowl-bodied freight diesels, all of which featured a rear cab window design nicknamed the Draper Taper. The Comfort Cab is also called the North American Safety Cab because of its collision safety technology, and was first adopted by U.S. railroads in the late 80s. By the new millennium, the final 4-axle diesels were built for freight service, and the last low-nose units were delivered to such railroads as the Illinois Central and Norfolk Southern. Since then, the wide nose has been essential to every modern diesel-powered freight locomotive, up to and including the EMD SD70 series and the GE Evolution series. Meanwhile, modern passenger diesels typically feature a streamlined monocoque shell rather than a hood unit style or even a cowl body. The first known example is the GE Genesis series, the most popular of which is the P42 DC. Several other builders have designed their own passenger locomotives in a variety of styles. So far, the most recent models are the Siemens Charger SC44 and ALC42, among other variants. North American electric locomotives might not be as ubiquitous as diesels, but there have been indeed a lot of models built over the years. Most electrics ran under a catenary system and have a full-width car body as well as a double cab on both ends. However, some have a road switcher hood like a diesel, most notably the E33 and E44 rectifier locomotives built by GE. It should be no surprise that the company produced more electrics than any other builder in North America, although it stopped manufacturing them in the 1980s. These locomotives used to provide both freight and passenger services, but today, newer electrics such as the Siemens ACS64 haul exclusively people. In recent years, though, some railroads have gained interest in locomotives that can produce zero exhaust emissions to combat climate change. In other words, they don't need overhead wires or any expensive infrastructure for propulsion. One method is battery power. While this is more than likely useful for yard switching, it's not impossible to design a 100% battery-powered road freight locomotive. Wabtec introduced what is known to be the first for that sort of work in 2020, the Flex Drive. In order to recharge the batteries on the road, the Flex Drive is capable of performing regenerative braking, where the traction motors act as electrical generators, producing energy that is otherwise dissipated as heat on a conventional diesel locomotive. Instead, much of the braking energy is stored into the batteries. Likewise, Progress Rail launched its own battery electric called the Joule in 2023. These are the major details that make up a road locomotive. You have now learned the fundamental differences between a switcher and a road locomotive, but we're not quite done yet because there is something in the middle. There are some smaller road locomotives that can practically run on the main line, but more importantly, they are just the right size for branch lines. In fact, some branches can have low clearances on tunnels or bridges, as well as speed restrictions, so the bigger mainline locomotives may or may not be able to pass through. As mentioned before, steam tank engines and early diesel road switchers were suitable for branch line services. Perhaps the best example is the infamous BL2 by Locomotive. It was essentially a rough transition between a cab unit and a hood unit. Let's not forget the gasoline-powered passenger rail cars, aka the Doodlebugs, from the early 20th century, as well as the Bud Company's rail diesel car, RDC, from the post-World War II years. Other types of locomotives might look like yard switchers, but they were especially powerful enough to haul freight cars within a large railroad terminal from one area to another. These are called transfer diesels. Although not intended for high speeds, they were capable of their high tractive effort. As a result, transfer units were also useful for pushing cars up a hump in some yards, and sometimes for assisting long, heavy freight trains up steep grades. Some were built in the form of cow and calf switcher sets by Locomotive. A cow and calf arrangement consists of a regular switcher and a cabless booster unit, respectively. However, the most common configuration of a transfer locomotive featured two diesel engines and a center cab. A couple of notable examples include the Baldwin DT 66-2000 and the Lima Hamilton LT 2500. So, to summarize, I have created a Venn diagram listing the differences between switchers and road locomotives, as well as those in the middle. Starting on the switcher side, steam shunters had 4, 6, or 8 drive wheels, but no leading or trailing wheels needed for that kind of job. Diesel switchers were built with either an end cab or a center cab, whereas electrics usually had a steeple cab. The duties for a shunter include railroad yards, locomotive shops, and in industrial areas. On the road locomotive side, steam engines were built with leading and/or trailing wheels in addition to their drivers. Some steamers have an articulated wheel arrangement containing more than one set of drivers. Diesel locomotives have been built in a variety of body styles, including cab units, hood units, and cowls. Mainline electrics are usually fitted with a double cab, except for the rectifier locomotives with road switcher bodies. The duties of a road locomotive are heavy haul freight and long distance or intercity/corridor passenger services. Lastly, the medium-sized duties such as branch line, hump, and commuter rail are performed by the following types of locomotives: a steam tank engine, a gasoline or diesel-powered doodlebug, a light road switcher, and a transfer diesel. It should be noted that when a railroad purchases a new locomotive model, an existing model would naturally be out of service in several ways, either retired and sent for scrap, sold to a new user, or even demoted to smaller jobs such as local trains. There are numerous examples, but I will name some of the most obvious cases. In the 1970s, the average locomotive horsepower rating was around 3,000, mostly due to one of the best-selling diesels of that time, the EMD SD40-2, which was indeed for road freight services. Moving up to the 21st century, the average was increased to 4,400 horsepower, as performed by such models as the GE AC4400CW and its successor, the ES44AC, not to mention their versatile alternating current traction motors. Because of those changes, many SD40-2s have been relegated to local trains on Class 1 railroads, or sold to smaller regionals and short lines. The Class 1 carriers have also retired a lot of their classic end cab switchers and replaced them with former road units such as the GPs and SDs, especially those rebuilt with EMD 710 Eco engines. Even some of the early wide-nose diesels, like the EMD SD60M and the GE-840CW, found their new careers on short-line railroads. Additionally, some of the big SD90 MAC units and several AC6000 CWs have operated on the Indiana Railroad and the western New York and Pennsylvania, respectively. Interestingly, Amtrak's Dash 8 32 BWH locomotives, which once hauled long-distance passenger trains in the West, have been reassigned to switching duties, albeit with their comfort cab designs. However, they can occasionally be seen as backup power in case any of the railroad's Genesis units, or to a lesser extent, the Siemens Chargers, are malfunctioning on the road. Alright, that pretty much sums up the facts on switchers and road locomotives. I hope that this gives you an idea on what makes them useful for shunting or for hauling heavy freight and passenger trains. Now, you probably heard me saying on the road a couple of times, which is the possible reason why we call them road locomotives. It's sort of like saying rolling down the highway. Of course, they're meant to run on railroad tracks, not paved roads. Besides, for those of you who live in Australia, I'm not talking about road trains, the ones consisting of a semi-truck and multiple trailers. The purpose of this video is to explain why the term road is used in North American rail terminology. I know it seems strange, but it's true, to the best of my knowledge. Can you identify your favorite engine as a switcher or road locomotive? Let me know what you think in the comments below. If you'd like to learn more about the types of locomotives, I've used much of the information from various sources that can be viewed on the LaRosa's Trains website. This is a bibliography listing websites, books, and DVDs specializing in trains. I'll put a link to it in the description of this video. If you'd like to support LaRosa's Trains, I would greatly appreciate it. That can be done through my Patreon page at patreon.com/LaRosa's Trains. Patrons will receive all kinds of benefits, which are explained directly on this page. Link is also in the description. Your donation, regardless of its amount, is essential not only to me, but to the future of LaRosa's Trains. Anyway, I hope you liked this video, and be sure to click the subscribe button to follow my YouTube channel. Thanks for watching. I'm Brian LaRosa, and I'll see you next time.